So when I requested this interview, I said that in the time I'd been here, this was the most riled I'd seen students, and I wondered if you'd agree with that.
I'd agree totally with that. I think it's, I've been here 6.25 years now, and it's by far the most difficult period since I've been here. So I think I agree entirely with your point.
And what do you think are the key contributors to that?
Well, obviously, I think there are 3 or 4 things, and some of them are long in the build-up, and then there's been a kind of spark. I think the things that have been long in the build-up are, of course, the whole new fees regime. You know, students are right in the middle of that now. You know, they're getting to learn to live with it. That's been ramped up with the political rhetoric. The general election last year made it a very big issue. And then spilling off the back of that, since the middle of last year, all of the press, or nearly all of the press, has been unremittingly negative about universities, which has kind of put a whole, it's not Lancaster I'm talking about, across the whole sector. And so that backdrop, you know, has begun to, I think, niggle away at people. And then, of course, what's the sparks? There's been 2 sparks at Lancaster, I think, which have added to it and brought it out, which are, one is obviously the national strike across the research-intensive universities of the UK, you know, 60-odd universities. And the second, which is a Lancaster-specific thing, is the Spine project, which has been one of the most difficult and, you know, intrusive refurbishments that the university's ever undertaken. So I think all of these things have added up. So I think, you know, you're dead right. It's really caused there to be a degree of unhappiness in the student population, and it's understandable.
So on the strikes, there's been some confusion about what your stance is on those. Do you want to clarify that stance now?
So the stance is extremely straightforward. We have always been in the camp of universities that want to see the best possible pension that can be paid from the USS to our staff. In the initial consultation, which was held last autumn, we were very clear that if it was at all possible, a combination of what's called defined contributions, or DC, and defined benefits would be our preferred position, but only if that was affordable. The whole process went on from the national level, from the autumn to Christmas. There was supposed to be, first deadline was the end of November, second deadline was the end of, or the middle of December, with obviously Christmas interfering, and then there was a January 23rd deadline. And at that point, the apparatus, the so-called Joint Negotiating Committee, came out with a decision which unfortunately had to be arrived at not through consensus, but through the chair taking a vote. Now, our position is that we understand that the DC scheme, the direct contribution scheme that's come out, is disadvantageous to staff. That's not a very satisfactory position to be in, but what's claimed is that is the most affordable, the only affordable solution. Now, if a more affordable solution can be that preserves the DB element, which is what staff really value, Lancaster is very open to that. And therefore the position, one of the things that I get asked in the numerous emails and letters that have come to me, I get asked to call for the reopening of negotiation. I don't quite understand what that question means, because the UUK position has always been, and is a Lancaster position, that any new proposal put on the table should be considered on its merits. So they've never closed down. That's different from going back to ground zero and starting where we should have been last autumn, because there's another pressure, which is that the pension regulator has demanded that a conclusion to the whole process well, it has to be by the end of June. And therefore going back to ground zero is just not possible. So my position is very clear. Any proposal should be considered. I think UUK are open to that. That's my understanding of their position. But it can't go back to a zero baseline position, because the time scale which is now available to us would then run us into trouble with the pension regulator.
But you acknowledge that the new scheme is disadvantageous to staff?
No, absolutely. And so the way I've thought long and hard about the best way I can explain this. And basically, we're being told by the pension scheme, which is then communicated to UUK, what can you buy for your money? And they're telling us they will offer us much less for what we can buy. So there's no money saving here. The money that we're intending to put into the new scheme will be absolutely the same as it was before. But what they're saying is they're saying now we won't sell you that anymore. So if they won't sell us it, we can't give it to staff. So that's the position. But it is a backward step. So that's why they're very annoyed, and we're not very happy about that either, because obviously we want to buy as much as we can for our money. We'd ideally like to buy the same, but we're being told we can't do that. So that's the difficult position we're in, that we want to give the maximum benefits. We'd ideally like to give the same benefits, but the people who supply the pension, which is USS, are telling us we won't sell you that. Now the problem, I don't want to kind of fog this discussion. Is the basis for why they're saying that is the source of the argument, but then it gets into very complicated actuarial science, which I don't pretend to be qualified in. But that's the source of the disagreement. But the backdrop is they won't sell us the same degree of benefits for what we're currently paying.
And you don't believe that UUK and UCU going back to talks would benefit?
But the point I'm making is that offer is on the table. I mean, in fact, there were talks earlier this week. There were talks earlier this week on Tuesday, and UCU for the first time tabled some detailed proposals. You know, there was 3 months leading up to their point where none of that was tabled before. The apparatus for considering that is meeting on the employer's side on Monday, and then there'll be another meeting of both UCU and UUK later next week. So it's happening.
Are these meaningful conversations though? Because I don't know if you saw the thing that was leaked in the Telegraph from the chair of UUK, saying that there was no plans to change their position regardless of negotiations.
No, I don't think that. I don't think so. That was followed up quite rapidly in the sector. You know, was that really the intention? The best intelligence I have is that those proposals will be seriously looked at. I mean, the problem is on those, they now have to be costed out. And I think I think what you're going to find, unfortunately, is a disagreement over the level of the costing. So, in the UCU proposal that's currently on the table, they've put some indicative costings from all of the details that I've seen, and it's not official. I mean, they're doing the work now, so it's not a conclusive position. Is that the UCU position in terms of what the additional, and that would mean additional costs for us. But those additional costs are nowhere near enough to buy, going back to the buying analogy, that they're asking for. So there's a mismatch there. But that has to be costed out, and is what's happening now. And there's a meeting, as I say, next Monday, where the employer's experts will have done more homework on what that proposal is and what it costs.
Do you sympathise with staff?
Of course, absolutely. I sympathise with them from the point of view of losing the benefits going backwards. None of us. Can I make the point here that it isn't only the staff, it's all, and the senior management are equally affected. So I'm not very happy about the backward step. But so from that point of view, I sympathise. I'm less sympathetic to the effect it's having on students.
Well, that's my next question. Do you support the strike action?
Well, I can't, because while I understand the strike is the only option, and I respect their right to do it, I don't think it's right, to put the students in the middle of the fight, basically, because to a certain extent you can say it's the only it's the only thing they can do. So while I have sympathy and I respect their right, I obviously, can't support the effect it's having on the student population.
So let's talk about that effect then on the student population. And we've already lost 5 days of teaching.
Yes.
Obviously what that means differs from student to student.
Yes.
And there's the potential now for 9 more days and threats that it will go on and on and on. So will students receive compensation?
Okay, so so in my post bag, the compensation question after negotiation is the second most common question I get. Now, of course, it's a perfectly legitimate question. What we need to do is we need to work out what in the end, after it's all over, because it will have to end sometime, what can be replaced, what can be meaningfully replaced, what is the effect that had on the experience and what you have actually lost. Those calculations will be done, And at that point, when we understand that, we will be absolutely coming back to students with what our intention is to, try and recompense them. But the point I want to make on that is it's very difficult at this moment in time to do any calculation both of the effect and what the right level of compensation might be in that situation. So, but what I'm certainly saying here is we of course will look at it.
That sounds a lot more optimistic than what we've heard from like Sharon Hutley and from statements from the university.
In what sense do you think it's more optimistic?
That the way you say it there sounds as if compensation is likely if there's a big impact.
Well, I mean, it goes on to say how big the impact. I mean, that's my whole point. It goes on to say how big is the impact. We can't assess that at the moment. But if that impact is real and meaningful, then it's a legitimate conversation for us to have. Exactly.
But even if the impact isn't huge, there's students out there at the minute who are calculating the cost per contact hour, and who feel that they should be getting that money back for every contact hour lost.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the very interesting thing is how variable the calculations are. So I understand that. But if you lose a contact hour, if something is able to replace it, then of course you've got to do a value judgment about what is the value of what's replacing it and how much did that cost, basically. So in other words, that's why I'm saying it's a very complicated calculation until you've come all the way through the end of the process. The other thing to say, and this is quite important, is, and I'll give you an analogy here, it also depends on how the student is paying. And what I mean by that is students are in different categories. If they're paying directly themselves from private money, then it's a much more immediate impact than if they're on the loan. Who do you pay back? Because if they've taken a student loan, who are you paying back? Because the student hasn't paid any money yet. The government's paid the money. Do you pay the money back to the government? So that's quite a complicated question. And again, that needs to be thought through. So we're going into very unknown territory here for the first time.
But you're not ruling out compensation?
Wouldn't rule anything out and anything in.
So kind of based on what you said at the beginning, do you think that students at Lancaster right now are getting the optimal experience?
I don't think they are. I mean, I can't sit here and claim that. How can it be optimal if you're missing classes that you should be having? How can it be optimal if there's a level of uncertainty about what you're going to experience each day, and also the environment? It's the most disrupted the environment has been. So I can't claim that. However, I hope there are many positive things still about being a student at Lancaster.
I think the issue is that even though you are, like I say, you sound more optimistic about compensation, there's still that it's probably not going to happen among students, and it seems counterintuitive that you'd say they're not getting the optimal experience yet they're still paying the full amount.
Yeah, but that's why it comes down to a difficult calculation. What is it you're buying? And that's what, and this is where education, unfortunately, because of the changes that have occurred in the funding, has changed in the last 7 or 8 years. With the so-called marketisation, which I think is somewhat problematic. It's changed the whole mindset, so it's been very commodified education. So the broader experience of what you're getting, and I'm not using that as an excuse, but I'm saying what it does is it's kind of symptomatic of the change of view of what education is all about. Now, I don't want to go into a philosophical discussion about it, but I think once the strike's over and we've sorted things out, I think the way the government tries to confront that issue about what education is for and the perception of it, rather than it being a commodity, which is what it's being seen now as, or more as now, I think is really important.
What do you make of education being seen as a commodity, you personally?
I don't like that concept at all. I think that education is much more than, it's not like buying a car or buying a house. It's buying a whole range more, and that seems to have been lost in the last few years, and that's a bit sad. Now, I understand how the government shifted, or why the government shifted in 2012 onto the current fee regime, where it became, it went from the 3,000 and then it went to the 9,000 and 9,250. I mean, as a response to austerity. But I think we're now living in a period of one of the unintended consequences of that. I think that there should always be a bargain between the state and the individual about how much each of them pay. It goes back to it because I think it's both a public good and a private good. and therefore I think that's been lost. I think with the new fees review that's been announced, I hope they don't lose the opportunity to completely rebase the conversation. I mean, what's it all about? What are we paying for? Do we look at it in the right way? All of those sorts of things, because I think it's gone far too far.
Mm. It's interesting you say that about how you feel about marketisation of education, because some people would say Lancaster's leading that marketisation with UA92.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's one way you could look at it, but I think it goes back to what you're selling. I mean, it's just a different model. I mean, the reason we're interested in it is that it's going to offer an alternative to the kind of degrees we offer here. Why that is seen or perceived as, I mean, why a provider like that should be seen naturally synonymous with being aligned with marketisation, I'm not quite clear about, because it's what you provide. And it's just a different way of providing education. It isn't trying to sell it as a more marketisable good. I know some people have said that, but I don't quite understand why it's being looked at that way.
Okay. Coming back onto the fees, and you made the point that fees for most UK students aren't paid directly from the student's bank account, but that's still debt that's accrued. And I was wondering, because last year this university made the decision, and it wasn't across the sector, to raise fees by £250, and that was made per university.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't. It was for each individual university, but almost all of them.
But it was still a choice.
Of course, it was a choice.
Yeah. And I was wondering, do you think that additional £250 a year reflects an additional £250 worth of experience?
Well, that's a good question, because let's make some assumptions here. The fee was set. The fee was set in 2012. Inflation since 2012 has made that worth somewhere between £8,000 and £8,300. So £250 on that means the students now getting it much cheaper in real terms than they were back in 2012. So although it's more money in absolute terms, in real terms it's actually gone backwards, and that's one of the reasons we had to put it up. Because if all our costs weren't going up, then we could afford to be much more circumspect about thinking about putting the fee up. But because inflation, particularly over the last 18 months, is beginning to eat in, our energy costs are going up, the costs of our staff. I mean, students say they want staff to be well rewarded. We've had to put the pay up over that period. It hasn't stood still since 2012 and 2018. So all of those pressures, have been bearing down on the university.
Has staff pay risen with inflation?
It's not gone up as fast as inflation, and in fact, there's an interesting. It's not gone up as fast, but it isn't where it is in 2012. So, and if you look where university lecturers are compared to the general population, particularly the public sector, they've held their own over that period. But I'm not pretending it's gone up with inflation. But it's
fees have.
Sorry.
But fees have. Do you see the?
No, but my point is they haven't.
Fees.
No, if you look at the inflationary rise, you'd have had to put on £9,000 to get to where we should be in 2018. They'd be well in advance of £9,250. So the only rise, the £250, is about 3%. Inflation between 2012 and 2018 will be well over 10% over that period, aggregated over that total period. So it's fallen backwards.
I think this point about staff salaries not raising with inflation, and also coming back to the pensions debate as well, it just seems from a student perspective that staff aren't always happy in their job, and there's not much that would motivate them to stay in this sector when they could potentially be making more in the private sector. Do you think their conditions are worse than it?
I would say not particularly, for the following reasons. One of the great things about academic life, and of course I was a typical lecturer then professor for the first 2/3 of my career, and I did it because of the freedom it gave me to think about the things I wanted to think about. You don't get that freedom in industry. So there are always trade-offs in life. The way you can structure your life, I think we're a pretty good employer. the benefits of flexible hours and those types of things, much more difficult to find in many other walks of life. So I mean, I'm not pretending everything is rosy, everything is rosy, but there are many positives. I put it this way, if I was going back 25 years, the question you could ask me is, would you still want to be a professor of physics? Absolutely.
Okay. A question sort of related to the strikes that a few people have been asking. Where are the savings from staff salaries going?
Yeah, that's a very legit. So we've ring-fenced it into a pot. So in other words, you can see where the money's going. It's not going to pay off any other bills at the moment. It's going into a pot, notionally initially the Student Hardship Fund, which is what we've always done in strikes in the past. What we said, and I said this at Senate last week, is that when we move into the next phase, whenever that is in the pensions discussion, individual staff will need to have advice on what the individual, because the problem is when you go to the new scheme, it's going to be individual by individual dependent, which is one of the things, the uncertainty it creates is one of the things that they're unhappy about. And we may use some of that money to pay for advice, but it'll be for the benefit of staff. Mm-hmm. So, it's ring-fenced, it's not going to be used for things other than helping either our staff or our students.
Okay. When students are paying so much money for this experience, they're quite concerned about where that money's being spent.
Yeah.
And one of the big things that you mentioned right at the beginning is obviously the spine. Do you think this spine work's been a bit shambolic?
It's been far from ideal. And I mean, I'm glad I'm doing this interview because I want to make it clear that I am sorry about the difficulty it's caused, and it hasn't been a very positive experience as a project, and it hasn't been a very positive experience for the people who use the spine. Could it have been better? Yeah, of course, yes, it could have. We always knew it was going to be a very complicated project. I think there was an underestimate of the level of complexity, and things have been found as been going on, like buried asbestos and stuff like that, which shouldn't have been there. No one was to know that when the project was started. These are not excuses. I'm just trying to explain why. But I am actually grateful for the kind of forbearance of people. That people have, obviously have expressed dissatisfaction, and I understand that. But overall, the level of kind of forbearance, I'm very grateful for.
Mm. But it is impacting the students.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I'm not trying to deny that. Of course it is, and I'm particularly sorry for the students who are going to have it for almost 2 years. It wasn't intended to be that way, but that's the way it's turned out, and we're sorry for that.
Mm. Do you think, given that and given these strikes, that this year students are getting value for money?
Well, value for money is a very. I think you could ask the question slightly different. I will answer your question, but I'll answer it a slightly different way. Are they getting the value for money that predecessors have got, and people who hopefully come after them? The answer is no. Are they getting value for money? Well, value for money is a very complicated question to answer, and the government has now stepped with the new Office for Students. The government is stepping into that space and demanding, that we show value for money. It's going to be very difficult to do this. It's very difficult to quantify. How do you quantify value? I mean, what do you put into the equation that says this is value for money? I think Lancaster people who graduate from Lancaster University are going to go on and do great things. The benefit of having a Lancaster degree for the future career, I think, is going to be borne out in most cases. The fact that we continue to be in the top 10, and this year, of course, University of the Year, they'll benefit from that title, even if they don't benefit in the physical experience. That must add to the value for money. So it's a very difficult equation to balance.
But do you think, given everything that's going on, that the experience students getting right now, forgetting about whether they pay it directly or not, do you think the experience is worth £9,250?
Okay, well, the worth is something, it's something the individual has to judge. All I can say is that if you look at the equation, the amount of money that we take in student fees at £9,250, so it's called in this country publicly funded teaching, that's the technical term for it, okay? Though you could argue whether it's publicly funded or not, but that's what it's called. Lancaster University this year broke exactly even on its publicly funded teaching. So therefore, there's no vast profit being made. It's about break even, and so I mean that's the best answer I can give about. I mean, worth is an individual judgment.
I think you bring up an interesting point there about students that are concerned about how the money's being spent, like I said, and I don't know if you saw the dispatches recently.
I did, yes, I made sure I watched it.
And I think there's this vision of you and Vice Chancellors in the sector generally as sort of jet setting away in business class and wining and dining with Gary Neville. Do you think that's fair? While staff are out in the snow picketing for
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, no, well, I'm not going to answer that question yes, am I? Because I don't think the answer is yes. I think it's definitely no.
That it's not fair?
Yeah, I think it's not a fair thing. I mean, if you look, Lancaster's senior team is pretty frugal. I'm not saying that we don't have good wages. We certainly have good salary, but we're very, very careful with the money we spend. Every time we take a trip, I mean, I think Scan recently asked for the number of business class and first class air tickets. I think if you examined that and you compared us with other senior teams across the country, I don't think that we're I mean, you have to make your own judgment on that, but I don't think.
I think it's unfair to say compared with other institutions because we're not at other institutions. We're talking about this institution
right.
And about whether it's fair that, as I say, staff are out picketing their unfair conditions, and UCU's protested casualisation, they've protested this pension dispute, and meanwhile management are taking these sort of expenses, these six-figure salaries. And I don't think it's fair to compare to other institutions.
But I mean, if you benchmark our salaries, if you benchmark, and okay, don't compare us against other institutions. I mean, I think the level of expenditure that you find at Lancaster is what is needed to do the job. I mean, if people have got suggestions for how we save on that or how they would prefer us to benchmark differently, I think we're absolutely happy to hear those things. But it's the context. I mean, if you think about, you talk about jet sets. So if you look at the people that do international travel here, for example, when people go to degree ceremonies, they go to degree ceremonies. They get on the plane, get off the plane the other end, might have a sleep the night before, do the degree ceremony, and come home. It would be completely unfair on them to ask them to do that and then come back into work the next day if they were travelling economy class. So I don't see business class travel, because if not, you'd have to add a couple of days for people to recover. So they'd be less efficient. So how much money are you saving when you do that?
People on lower grades of pay travel economy class though for work.
Yeah, but they do. But they also. I mean, if they can show that they've got all this pressure, the short turnaround times, things like that. That's pretty unusual for more junior staff.
Okay. So we're talking about sort of, high salaries and this idea of jet setting and travelling around. Do you think the university is run as a business or as an education institute?
I think, I hope it's run. I mean, go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. The core things that I believe in are delivering a high quality education to people with backed up by excellent research. I think that's what makes a high quality university a high quality university. And that's at the core of what we're trying to do. We're not, if we were trying to maximise, inverted commas, profit, you wouldn't run the university this way. So I think that's the reassurance that people, just to look at the facts, if you're wanting to maximise profit, you wouldn't run the university this way. And I think those principles of how we run the university show we're not aiming to run it as a business. That doesn't mean we don't have to be disciplined in how we run the university, because we can't be, it can't be amateurish in the way it's run, but that's not saying that it's run as a business. It's just run, what I would say, hopefully, professionally, but with those core principles at its heart.
I think that's a good place to end it.
Is that all right?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
No. Well, I hope that covered. Well, obviously, we covered the ground you wanted.
Yeah.
And I mean, I tried to engage with you as straightforwardly.
No, yeah, I did appreciate your frankness.
Yeah. And I mean, the one point that you talked about compensation, we will look at it. But absolutely, as I said, I'm not ruling anything out or anything in. We will just look at it because it's an interesting legal area as well. It's never been tested. So we'll see.